Hello and welcome to the Classical Next podcast, the global platform for the ideas and the people redefining classical and art music worldwide. I'm your host, David Taylor. Today, I'm talking with Caroline Whiddon, the executive director and co-founder of Me Too, a classical music organisation created for individuals with mental illnesses and the people who support them. The organisation started in Vermont in 2011 and has grown to include orchestras, choruses, and even a flute choir located in 3 New England states. The unique nature of Me Too's work has garnered attention from the NBC Today Show, Al Jazeera, and the BBC, as well as numerous newspapers, including the Boston Globe and the New York Times. A feature-length documentary about Me Too's work titled Orchestrating Change was broadcast on PBS stations across the US in the fall of 2020, and you can find a link to this in the show notes. In this conversation, we dive into how classical music can serve as a vehicle for social change and a sanctuary for mental health. We look at how removing audition and fees creates an inclusive, stigma-free environment, and why leading with love can transform orchestra management. We also explore the practical accommodations that help musicians thrive, the power of community making as part of mental health treatments, and how civic partnerships offer a new future for arts organisations. Right, that's enough from me. Let's jump in. Hi, Caroline. It is so good to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm really excited to talk to you about everything to do with the Me Too Orchestra. And I was working on an introduction for this, but realised it's kind of pointless because who better to tell me and everyone else listening about the orchestra than you? So could you tell me a little bit about what the Me Too Orchestra is, but also why it needs to exist?
Well, I can tell you that the Me Too Orchestra is the world's only classical music organization created for people living with mental illness and their allies. And then I can expound on that and tell you what exactly that means. But first, I should probably tell you what we are not. We have a bit of a branding snafu because we started just before the very popular hashtag Me Too movement got launched and made a very intentional decision not to change our branding throughout that period because we had a lot of big publicity out there with our name, but we are not aligned with the wonderful and important hashtag Me Too movement. We are a different movement. We are all about classical music and mental health. We started in Burlington, Vermont in 2011, and our story grows out of me meeting the conductor Ronald Brownstein. We met as colleagues in Vermont during a period where Ronald was struggling with symptoms of bipolar disorder, and we both left the organization where we had been working and started to date. A little preview there of what's to come. We did become a couple, and he said to me, "I want to start an orchestra for people like me." And at that point, I was pretty crazy about him, but I'll have to say I was a little hesitant to launch something that to me was a very foreign idea. I mean, I really hadn't thought about music as a vehicle for social change, and certainly hadn't thought about pairing the ideas of classical music with mental health. So we spent, several months talking about what that might look like. What did that mean? And in very simple terms, it meant creating a safe space and maybe doing a little targeted recruitment from the mental health community, we'll say. And we started with 8 or 9 musicians at a little orchestra rehearsal in Burlington, Vermont, and today we're operating in 3 states with numerous ensembles. So that's the quick, the overview of who we are and kind of what we're doing right now.
Incredible. And I'm really fascinated to hear about what the reception to this was. Because just thinking back about the timeline, and although in 2026 we're much better at talking about things like mental health, we still have work to go. But this is what, back in 2011? And I remember I was studying at music college at the time, and the idea of discussing things like mental health then was so alien, still with so much stigma at the time. So what was the sort of the reception and how to have those conversations at the beginning? What did that really look like?
Right, I mean, it was honestly, it was very awkward, we weren't we hadn't gone through the pandemic as we have now, which I think was really a tipping point in many ways across the world in terms of people recognizing, their own issues with mental health and isolation, and that's changed the way we talk about mental health now, but in 2010 and 11, we it was really still a taboo topic. People lowered their voices and didn't wanna talk, especially about serious mental illness, about schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and addiction. So we were very unsure about the type of reception we would get. And that's where I'll go back to Ronald's story because he had studied and appeared at the highest levels. He was actually, the first and only American to ever win the Herbert von Karajan gold international competition. He won the gold medal right after graduating from Juilliard, and it was just this incredible launch to his career. And at that point, he knew he had some differences in his personal energy, we'll say, but he didn't recognize that as depression and mania. He had not been diagnosed. So he wins this international competition and goes out into the world and is guest conducting the best orchestras in Europe. He's coming back, to do the San Francisco Symphony and then conducting in New York and Dallas, and but his career starts to sort of take on the highs and lows of the mania and depression, right? Which makes sense. When he was kind of high with energy, he might do well, or he might be too manic to be able to focus and do well. And when he was depressed and in bed, he would lose contracts. So eventually, after several years of this, he lost his management. He ended up back in New York working for Juilliard, conducting the pre-college orchestra there and also directing the American, Opera Center. And that I think the scheduling of that worked better with his diagnosis, and around that time, he got diagnosed, but it was a lighter schedule, and he could somewhat handle that and thrive in that space, but before he took the job in Vermont, he had left the orchestral world, and he was doing actually design work. He has a wonderful eye for visual art and trained as a graphic designer, but he was missing the orchestral world. So he applied for this job in Vermont, and I was on the committee actually that hired him to come and work in Vermont, and I had never seen anything like it. And I'm trained as a musician, and I've worked with a lot of conductors, but I saw magic happening on the podium when he came to audition, and I was so thrilled that we were able to secure this incredible man and musician to come work with us, and yet it was evident he was having trouble with his mental health. It is quite unfortunate that he was then let go from that job, and that was during a period when he was really brutally stigmatized, and I would say he was discriminated against on the job. So, having endured all that, we started this organization from a very low place. Ronald had thought about changing his name. I mean, there had been so much publicity around this topic, and, he had supporters, and then he had people that just said, "If this man has bipolar disorder, it doesn't matter if he's a great conductor or a fabulous musician. He shouldn't be working with people. He should just go home and get on government assistance and just try to take care of his health." Which to me just it blew my mind. I thought the world is gonna be missing out on such an important message that this incredible artist has to deliver through music, that people with bipolar disorder can, in fact, be treated and thrive. So that became the basis, for these discussions. How do we are there other musicians who would be willing to sort of step out of that comfort zone and say, "Yeah, me too. I have a diagnosis as well. And maybe I haven't played in a few years, but it would be great to come into a space where I knew that I wouldn't have to disclose anything, but if I did wanna talk about my mental illness, it would be okay. I'd be in a safe space." And we really started with that very simple, germ of an idea, and then got some good publicity for it, and it just started to kind of slowly grow and grow and grow. And within our own kind of safe space, it became very liberating to be able to know that once a week you could go into orchestra rehearsal. And if you weren't doing great, that was okay. People were gonna still be there to support you and rally around you. um, I think a very important decision we made early on was that in order to be inclusive and in order to attract people to this very, different idea of melding mental health and music, we decided no auditions, no fees to participate. And I think it speaks to, the genius of Ronald Brownstein that he was able to make that work in a really, especially starting out, a very kind of ragtag room, right? People with a lot of different experience levels, people who maybe hadn't played in years, and yet I think because of the love and support that were core to the room, he was able to make that work.
It's such an incredible journey, especially from such a challenging scenario. And as you were speaking about sort of the difficulties of Ronald's journey with having bipolar in a professional musician's life, I was thinking about here in the United Kingdom, where I'm based. There's something in work called making reasonable adjustments for people, whether it's through
Yes.
disabilities or through mental health and various different things. And in, let's say, in an office environment, that is something that is quite easy to put in place, or is much more commonplace to do. Whereas in the performing music world, there's very little conversation about what that might look like for changing how rehearsals would work, the international touring schedule. I was thinking in particular from, as you mentioned, about Ronald going around the world to conduct orchestras and just the total removal of structure, support networks, and all of these things. Do you think we have an industry that is potentially, I don't want to say set up to make people with mental health challenges have a more difficult time, but is it potentially something that doesn't necessarily have the safeguards to make people thrive?
Boy, I think we can do anything we want to, but we tend to fall back on, I'm sorry, I'm going to say this word, our elitist backgrounds, where things to create high art, high music that we have to operate in a certain way, when in fact, making those reasonable accommodations can be really such a simple thing. I mean, granted, we're doing it within a volunteer community orchestra, but if I have a musician come in who says, I haven't played in a long time and I tend to have panic attacks. I have a lot of anxiety. That I can say, "Let's talk about your placement on the stage or in the rehearsal room. If you need to be closer to a door and you know that I'm telling you right now, it's okay for you to get up and leave. Or if you fall into full on panic, yes, come back and I'll be backstage to meet you. Offering that little extra reassurance is such an easy thing. And in terms of, Ronald's schedule, even now, if we're traveling to speak somewhere at a conference, a mental health conference or something, I always make sure that we fly in at least a day before so that he can get a good night's rest. Sleep is very important. A good meal is very important. All these things, that we all need, but that especially with the bipolar diagnosis, if you don't have them, they can trigger some instability. So we just, factor in a little more time, maybe an extra night in a hotel room. These are not incredibly difficult things. I think the bigger challenge is to change people's mindset because people have heard so many horror stories, and they think, well, if you have bipolar disorder, that means that you will behave a certain way that will not allow you to operate, in a functional way within an orchestral setting. And the truth is, most people with bipolar disorder can manage it quite well. We just don't hear those stories, right? We hear the nightmare about schizophrenia and someone having their very worst day and lashing out violently. But that's rare. Most people are actually, if we catch the treatment well, and this, I fall back on society has not figured this out yet. We're not very good with treatment, but if we can treat people quickly, get them into good treatment, that these diagnoses are manageable, and then just tweak little things in the rehearsal and the performance venues. It's actually easier than people would think.
That's really heartening to know that it's something that is actually really achievable and not a incredible challenge that we have to reinvent the wheel for.
Yeah.
As you were speaking about some of these practicalities, I was really fascinated as sort of to how you potentially implement this from a a management level. Before your role with the Me Too Orchestra, you were executive director of the Vermont Youth Orchestra. So, how do you run an organization like this when there's no auditions and no participation fees? And then also, how do you run it when there's potentially multiple individual requests or circumstances that need adaptation?
I this is gonna sound a little hokey, but we were talking about this with a group of our donors recently, and someone said that they feel that this organization succeeds because all the people in leadership positions lead with love. And I thought it was such a beautiful way to very succinctly, express what we try to do, but it is approaching every room, every discussion with an open mind and a desire to support people. Because, again, usually what people need is not a big thing, it can be a very little thing. And this organization started with Ronald and I kind of going into the room and modeling what we thought was stigma-free behavior. We modeled the support that we wanted to see people giving each other. And I'm so happy to say that, all these years later, we've first of all identified other conductors who are working with all of our various ensembles who also model this behavior, who live the love and the support for their musicians. But also we have rooms full of musicians now who model that behavior when they walk in the door. They often say, I walk into rehearsal and the first thing I see is the sign that says you are entering a stigma-free zone. And that serves 2 purposes. It reminds me that I can relax. I'm entering a safe space. But it also reminds me that I have a responsibility to the person sitting next to me and the other people in the room. It's a reminder that I'm there to support them too. So it's just making that commitment to honestly to be decent people and to give people a little extra room. It's, it's just not that hard. But you gotta be open to it.
Definitely, and I think what a wonderful thing, a commitment to be a decent person. I think something that sounds so simple, but we could be reminded of more regularly in society.
Right? I mean, I count myself among those people because there are the days when you get kind of frustrated or you don't understand why something is taking so long or someone needs extra time for this. And I just kind of go, oh, you know what? I don't know what that person is dealing with. And whatever urgency I'm feeling in my timeline right now is probably, I'm making that up. I can take a deep breath and give somebody a little space. It's a pretty good rule for life, right? But it's something that we're practicing in the orchestra, and then hoping has this ripple effect that people take that out into the community, treat each other a little more kindly, and then if they have a neighbor or a friend who is struggling with depression or anxiety or addiction, that they're open to having a conversation with them, not just shutting it down and cutting them off, which unfortunately has often been the case, right?
So it's really heartening to hear. One thing I really wanted to ask about the orchestra and about something you said earlier is that it's an orchestra for musicians, for people suffering with mental health or are allies of people suffering with mental health. What was behind the decision to make it not just for the people who are suffering themselves, but also for the ally community as well?
Largely grew out of a an email that I got from one of my former colleagues in Vermont. When Ronald had been hired, it was clear he was struggling. He was doing beautiful work on the podium, but really struggling with a lot of the more administrative tasks and being organized. And I got an email from one of my staff members who said, Caroline, we on the staff believe that this man has a mental illness, and we don't know how to work with that. And to me, that was like a sucker punch to the gut, right? Because my response had been, I actually, Ronald had not disclosed his diagnosis to me at that point, but I too thought he had a mental illness. And I considered it my job to figure out how to support him and how to work with that. So that message really stuck with me. And when Ronald and I started having conversations about building this Me Too supportive environment, I thought, we're not going to eradicate stigma. We're not going to change anybody's mind if we adopt more of a kind of the traditional support group structure where everybody who's invited has their own diagnosis. We've got to include people who don't have a diagnosis and maybe don't have that much experience that they know of, working with or living, adjacent to people who have a mental illness so that there is always learning happening, so that we're always growing as human beings in this space. So we have these beautiful situations where you've got a clarinetist who maybe doesn't have a diagnosis, doesn't have a lot of experience with mental illness, but is sitting right next to a clarinetist who is living with a dissociative disorder or schizophrenia. And the way they meet is because they're playing Beethoven together, and that's going well, and that's great. And then eventually, maybe, you know, one of them starts talking about going to therapy or their medication, and the story starts to seep out. And so I think meeting in that very kind of beautiful communal music making space, it gives us an easier entry to that discussion. Not just let's sit down and talk about schizophrenia, but rather let's sit down and play Beethoven together, and then we'll see where that goes. Like, even I hear myself talking about it, and I'm like, "It's magical." I want everyone to experience, that entry to mental health discussions, and I think that's what we figured out is that's one of the things that we can do well, right? I mean, we can take this amazing art form that admittedly has been historically kind of elitist, but we can convene people for music making to come attend a concert and then sort of gently introduce this topic of mental illness and what it really means to live with a diagnosis and encourage other people to think about it, to talk about it, to maybe learn more about it. So it's just a different way into the discussion than what we might usually be faced with.
Definitely. I guess perhaps this is sort of a way of normalizing it instead of it being here is an orchestra that is isolationist for people with this experience and that's where they have to live and they can't go and live and connect with other people. It's a way of building bridges and making it something that is just part of life.
Well, and David, I always tell people, I trained as a professional musician and I've spoken to some of my, classmates from school and they go, "Oh, the joke is, "Oh, you created an orchestra for people living with mental illness. How's that different than my orchestra that I play in now?" And the difference is, yes, we all are existing in rooms with people who are living with we don't know what, with various diagnoses. The difference is it's safe to talk about it in our space, and whereas especially in the professional classical music world, it can be still very heavily stigmatized and could be used against someone if they need to take time off for treatment or if their behavior is seems a bit odd in rehearsal and they don't have an explanation for that. So, we're just saying, "Yeah, it's okay to talk about it." I remember a funny story early on with the orchestra where, there were a bunch of us ladies sort of in the back of the brass section, and during the break, someone said, "Does anyone have a Tylenol or painkiller?" And the funny thing was everybody had, lots of, like, anti-anxiety meds and then, in their purses, but nobody could come up with a basic aspirin or a Tylenol, but we all got to laugh about that together, and when you're someone who lives with anxiety, that kind of group experience and laughter makes life a little bit easier.
100%. And it's great to hear sort of the reception from the participants as what that's like. Um
Yeah.
Speaking of reception, I'm really fascinated to hear what the reception to all of this has been like. But you mentioned at the beginning when you had the brand clash with the Me Too movement. Obviously, you started before, and one of the reasons you didn't want to change was there's such media coverage about the orchestra and what you do. But also, I'd love to hear more about those individual stories and the impact, not just in the press, but also to the people who are participating. What has the receptions of the orchestra been like?
It's it's been surprising. I think Ronald and I very much own the fact that we started this organization as a way of creating safe space for ourselves and for Ronald to be able to continue making music. And we thought it could have an impact, but we had no idea how rich it could be and how powerful it could be. But it turns out even a one night a week rehearsal can serve as an anchor in someone's life, especially if they are self isolating, or if they have lost contact with their family, maybe due to mental illness. We've had people actually say, I have reconnected with family and friends in a way that I was too intimidated to do until I found Me Too. And so Me Too has kind of served as a reintroduction back into society. And I think that, there again, that speaks to the inclusion of allies, right? That we didn't want it to be just people living with a diagnosis. We needed to show people if they were feeling like maybe they weren't worthy or weren't able to fully participate in society, that there are people without a diagnosis who are fine with whatever you've got going on, you know? And so that's led them back to renewing relationships that they had lost before. We have seen musicians, take on new careers, go back to school, really through I guess, just a newfound confidence. I've watched so many people who really just kind of blossom, and I think, gosh, one night a week, how could it have that effect? But, I think I'm so intrigued right now with this, ever emerging field of neuroarts and the science that we can now put behind these very beautiful moments, these artistic moments. But we do know now, and we have the science to prove that one night a week of music making, of art making, can in fact be an important part of someone's mental health treatment. And I have had numerous people in our orchestras, now our chorus and our huge flute choir in Boston, who have said to me, "This one night a week that I'm making music with you is part of my mental health treatment plan." They consider that part of the plan.
Definitely, and it's great to hear there's so many personal stories that sometimes get sort of swept, or difficult to quantify in a way that isn't just big shiny press exposure. Even though obviously you've had the
Right.
incredible coverage of PBS feature length documentary and everything else that comes into it. You mentioned about the chorus and the flute choir. It seems that Me Too as an organisation is ever growing. It's not just one orchestra; it's three: flute choir, chorus, and now an affiliate network as well. Can you tell me about the expanded Me Too, I guess, cinematic universe type thing?
Love that word, cinematic universe, yes. We, I think we recognized early along that even though we were trying to do our best to remove barriers to participation by not having auditions and not charging any fees, that with an orchestra, you still have to know how to play a string instrument or a bassoon, and not everybody has those skills. So it really just felt very natural that as we wanted to include more people and more people wanted to be included, everybody has a voice. So, including a choral component felt very natural and has in fact helped to, I see really diversify, the the people that are able to join us. We have younger people, people who have never sung before or maybe only in the shower, and they're coming in and joining the chorus and learning and growing together. People with maybe some physical limitations that might have kept them, or discouraged them from playing an instrument, but they can show up and sing, and it's just such a beautiful group. So we have that group rehearsing on Wednesday nights in Boston. And then we also, because we had such a lengthy wait list of flutists wanting to join the orchestra, and we had to put a cap on that. You really at some point you have to say we don't have room for more flutes. But there's so many flutists out there. So now we have, the last count was a 36 member roster for our flute choir, and they played at Boston Symphony Hall last year. They're playing at a lot of senior centers and, healthcare facilities and just having a ball. So we're looking for lots of ways to start different types of ensembles that will help us reach even more people. You mentioned the idea of affiliation, and that was a direction that we were really focused on prior to the pandemic, and I will say most of that energy just came to a halt during the pandemic. But as we're entering back into a strategic planning mode, I do hope that we'll let that dream, bubble up to the surface again because I think this idea is certainly replicable. Like most things, it takes money and some hands-on direction, but practically any ensemble could be stigma-free, could be a Me Too orchestra or chorus, if they wanted to be. So we're constantly thinking about how do we reach more people.
Definitely. I imagine you may not be able to say everything if you're in the planning phase, but what do you see as sort of the strategic future of Me Too? Where are you sort of hoping to take this going forwards?
Goodness. I do think we see that there are limitations to the places that we can reach. Some of that is actually kind of physical. When you've got a 60-piece orchestra, you can't get into every facility to reach people. And we have been playing in gymnasiums, in correctional facilities. We've been to a big tent in Boston South End to play for people that are living on the street, but it's getting a little unwieldy with such a large group. And also, even with the chorus and the flute choir, we can break down into smaller groups, but our musicians are largely in school or working during the day. They don't have as much flexibility in their schedules. So, one of my dreams is that at some point we will add a professional layer to what we're doing so that we can take things into the schools and maybe doing more presentations during the day. I'm not sure what that will look like. I don't wanna get ahead of myself, but I think some sort of professional, paid, layer to the ensembles would be very cool and would help us reach a lot of people. The other thing that's big on my mind, and I'll go back to my reference to the field of neuro arts, we're seeing some really exciting civic partnerships happening around the world. It's happening in the UK. In Chicago, they've got some great things going on where artists are pairing with city, Department of Public Health, Department of Mental Health, and really partnering on, their objectives and treating our communities, but in a partnership-oriented way. And so I'd like to look at developing more of those partnerships. I think so often it can be very easy to get something off the ground and operate in a silo. But we're looking to take some more direction from the people leading our communities in terms of how we can help our communities be healthier.
Really, really interesting part. There's a question that's been in the back of my head for a while. I'm not entirely sure what the answer to this would be. But I mentioned about back in 2011 when you started sort of talking about mental health in music educate or music full stop was challenging. Back then I was at music college, and I remember that one of the department heads was basically giving everyone beta blockers instead of helping them with performance anxiety and things.
Mm.
Or do you think we can maybe take some of the lessons from Me Too and embed it earlier on in music education in some of those high pressured environments to give people the skills and acceptance they may need to go on and work and thrive in the career going forwards?
Gosh, well, I mean, I think acknowledging things is first and foremost. I was back in music school years before you were, but we didn't even acknowledge it, and I had horrible stage fright. But the beta blockers were, shared very privately, and if you didn't have someone to hook you up, then you were just gonna be scared on stage. I don't know that beta blockers are always the answer, and I'm happy to say we've come very far in the field of therapy, and it would be wonderful to have more kind of health and wellness embedded in our musical educations. I was talking to Ronald recently about reading an article that spoke about the art of conducting as being you're an athlete. They develop so many different physical symptoms from moving their arms and legs and so much and for so many hours during the day. And I don't know that our conservatories and our music schools are really looking at the whole person as much as they could be. It's getting better. It's absolutely getting better, but having really robust counseling and therapy offices and having private teachers who are well versed in these things, not that they're offering treatment per se, but that they can recognize symptoms and maybe suggest that someone get some support when it's needed. That's the kind of thing that didn't happen when I was in school in the '80s and the '90s. I'd love to hear that it's happening more today, but I don't know.
I think it's definitely much better than it was when I was studying, especially in terms of normalizing the conversations and student bodies in particular are certainly more vocal. So I'm certain we're further ahead, but it seems that with the incredible lessons and journey of Me Too, there's so much that we can take to really sort of move on and build with. Um, so at the end of all of these chats, we have a couple of rapid fire questions to throw at you.
Oh boy.
So the first one is very, very simple, which would be if you could change one thing in the industry, what would it be?
Boy. I'm sorry, I'm so cheesy. More love, more support, I think, the the drive towards perfectionism actually doesn't do us a great service. Not only is it bad for our mental health, I'm not really sure that it's that great for the music making. It kind of homogenizes the sounds of groups, and I love it when when something gets maybe not so perfect, but when musicians really go for something. So let's just approach it all with a little more love and support for each other.
Oh, fantastic. What a wonderful, wonderful piece of advice. And then the final question would be, what gives you hope for the future of classical music?
Boy, I would have to say it's the smaller organizations who are nimble and who are actually doing more inventive programming and reaching different audiences, and that's one of the things that Me Too does. But I love that I'm seeing professional orchestras, or sorry, professional chamber music groups largely who are going into soup kitchens, into homeless shelters, and bringing great art to people that need it. We all need access to beauty. It's what makes life worth living. So there are certain organizations I could name, but it's the smaller groups that are doing some really cool programming and reaching different audiences, and that makes me think maybe they're going to lead some of the bigger organizations into adopting some of that outlook on how we operate.
I'd like to thank Caroline Whiddon for joining me, and thank you for listening. If you have any thoughts on today's episode, or if there's someone you think I should be talking to for the show, you can find Classical Next on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram, or just reach out through the website. And if you found the show useful, please do subscribe and share it with your friends and colleagues. I'm David Taylor, and I'll see you next time.